of people that your father would have known that could have been high-level Nazis.
Frankly, if this were really a picture of Hitler, it would change history. I mean, this is potential proof positive that the guy got to Argentina.
Could one photo change what we thought we knew about the end of World War II? For years, it was hidden, but now it has come to light, and something doesn't feel right. This one photo is about to change history forever. Join us as experts discover Hitler's last photo from 1945, then zoom in and turn pale. Hitler's very last photograph. The very last photograph of Adolf Hitler alive is quite a strange sight, if you ask me. It shows him standing outside his underground bunker, staring at the wreckage in front of him that used to be Berlin. Right by his side is his longtime aide, Julius Schaub, and one of the few people still loyal to him in those final days. In fact, this photo was taken in late April 1945, just days before Hitler took his own life. And when you really think about that moment, it hits you. This was the man who'd started a world war, who had terrorized millions, and now he was looking at the ruins of a city he once ruled. Unfortunately, pictures don't tell thoughts, so no one ever really knows what he was thinking or feeling in that moment. It's hard not to wonder what was going through Hitler's mind as he walked outside the Fuhrerbunker. After years of being shielded from the madness he himself unleashed, kept away from all the blood, the firebombings, and the loss, he was now face to face with it. The city was crumbling, Soviet troops were closing in, and Germany was in ruins. Maybe it all came crashing down in his head too. We'll never really know. But shortly after that walk, we know exactly what happened. A gunshot. That's how his story ended. Julius Schaub, the man beside him in the photo, wasn't nearly as infamous. He'd been with Hitler since the early 1920s, even before the Nazi Party took power. Apparently, he was more of a personal assistant than a policymaker. He wasn't part of the military strategies or the genocide plans. Neither did he give speeches or sign death orders. All he did was handle Hitler's documents, schedule meetings, and stayed close. Basically, he played the role of a loyal servant through it all.
The only certainty is that the decision was made in 1941, possibly in several stages. Was there a verbal order from Hitler?
After Hitler's death, however, Schaub followed one last instruction. He burned everything the dictator left behind. Letters, documents, personal belongings, anything that could fall into Allied hands. When the Americans caught him, they interrogated him but ultimately didn't find him guilty of any war crimes. He was labeled a fellow traveler, which means someone who supported the Nazis but didn't really do anything criminal themselves. Schaub quietly faded into the background after the war. He wasn't prosecuted, and he didn't write any tell-all memoirs. He simply went back to Munich, where he lived until his death in 1967, 22 years after Hitler died. One of Hitler's secretaries later described Schaub as a kind man, but also added that he was, frankly, not very interesting. It's strange, isn't it? To be that close to one of the most evil men in history and still be remembered as harmless, even dull. The Fuhrerbunker. This photo of Hitler's famous bunker, called the Fuhrerbunker, is one of the most telling photos after his movement crumbled. But let us take it back to where it all started, the afternoon of April 30th, 1945. Hitler's world was coming to an end, and inside this same bunker, it felt different. It felt like defeat. Soviet artillery was pounding the city above, and the once mighty Third Reich was in its final moments. So after a quiet lunch that day, around 2:30 p.m., Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, who had only married the day before, retired to Hitler's private quarters. They didn't say goodbye to most people, only a few aides and secretaries. Everyone knew what was about to happen, even though it wasn't openly discussed. Hitler had already given strict instructions. His body must not be captured. He was terrified of ending up on display like Mussolini, whose corpse had been mocked and hung upside down in Italy just days earlier. At exactly 3:30 p.m., the sharp sound of a gunshot echoed through the bunker. Those waiting outside his study didn't react right away. They had been bracing for it. Finally, Hitler's longtime valet, Heinz Linge, entered the room and saw Eva slumped to the left on a couch. She had swallowed a cyanide capsule. Hitler sat next to her, lifeless, slumped forward in his chair. A pistol was right at his feet, and blood was dripping from a gunshot wound on the right side of his head. According to his wishes, the bunker staff sprang into action between 4 and 6:30 p.m. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried up a narrow staircase to the Reich Chancellery Garden, just outside the emergency exit of the bunker. Then the corpses were laid side by side, doused in petrol and set on fire again and again until they were almost completely destroyed. The remains were then buried in that same crater in a hurry under ongoing shell fire. Fast forward to the 2nd of May, 1945. A Soviet military counterintelligence unit called SMERSH discovered the charred remains of Hitler, Eva Braun, and even their dogs. And so, over the next few months, the Soviets secretly exhumed, reburied, and relocated the bodies multiple times as they moved their operations around Berlin. Eventually, on the 21st of February 1946, the remains were buried in Magdeburg, East Germany, in the grounds of a SMERSH facility. Then, nearly 25 years later, on the 4th of April 1970, the Soviets faced yet another problem. The SMERSH facility was being handed over to the East German government, and they feared the site might be discovered and turned into a shrine for neo-Nazis. So, the Soviets dug up the remains one final time. Then, they cremated the bones and scattered the ashes in the Biederitz River, just outside Magdeburg. What was left? Right after Hitler and Eva Braun ended their own lives that day, the bunker was quite the scene to behold. Experts explored that place and found that it was a cramped network of rooms beneath Berlin, with thick 4-meter concrete walls and a small, sparse interior. After descending the stairs into the lower section and passing through the steel door, there was a long corridor with a series of rooms on each side. On the right side were a series of rooms which included ventilation rooms and the telephone switchboard. On the left side was Eva Braun's bedroom and sitting room, which also served as Hitler's private guest room, an antechamber which led into Hitler's study office. In all, there were roughly 20 rooms, not much furniture, just a plain sofa, a few chairs, and a couple of portraits on the walls, including Frederick the Great, above Hitler's desk. An oxygen balloon also sat there, in case ventilation failed or gas was released inside. Hitler's remaining staff clustered together, and survivors later said they felt like a family in the bunker. In the immediate aftermath, Western reporters like life photographer William Vandevert were allowed into the bunker's wreckage. He photographed the ruined room where Hitler and Braun died. He was able to successfully capture the sofa stained with blood and the disordered interiors. Then he called it a surreal encounter in the fallen city. In the decades that followed, and for obvious reasons, the Fuhrerbunker was completely erased from public view. After World War II, the Soviets attempted to destroy or bury it. They filled the tunnels with rubble, demolished the structures, and eventually sealed it off under sand and concrete. The East German government later demolished most remnants during the late 1980s. Today, if you go there, you'll find nothing above ground, just a plain old parking lot behind apartment buildings between Potsdamer Platz and the Holocaust Memorial. There's no preserved bunker entrance or anything grand, just a discreet metal sign installed in 2006 that marks where the bunker once lay. Hitler walking with Helga Goebbels in 1936. This photo shows Hitler walking with Helga Goebbels in the year 1936. And in case you're wondering, she's one of the daughters to Joseph and Magda Goebbels, Hitler's most devoted followers. Joseph served as Hitler's Minister of Propaganda from 1933 until the end of World War II. He controlled all media, arts, and information in Nazi Germany, spreading Hitler's ideologies and fueling hatred against Jews and other targeted groups. Hitler trusted him to a great length, and Goebbels remained loyal even as the Third Reich crumbled. Magda Goebbels, on the other hand, was seen as the First Lady of the Reich before Hitler tied the knot with Eva Braun. She idolized Hitler almost like a god. Now, of all the terribly sad stories connected to Hitler's downfall, the death of the Goebbels children stands out as the most heartbreaking. Hitler was oddly fond of those 6 kids, Joseph and Magda Goebbels' children.
Eva Braun capturing many such encounters with her home cinecamera. The children were mainly the sons and daughters of high Nazi officials, particularly those of Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels.
And he was particularly affectionate toward the eldest, 12-year-old Helga. In fact, many said to Hitler they represented the future of his twisted vision. But in the end, that same vision led to their death at the hands of their own mother. By the last days of April 1945, everyone on Hitler's side knew the war was all but lost. The Allies were closing in. Berlin was in ruins. Hitler had retreated into his bunker, and with him were some of his most devoted followers, including the Goebbels family. Joseph Goebbels was indeed Hitler's propaganda minister, but it was Magda, Joseph's wife, who made the final decision to seal her children's fate. Magda believed there was no life worth living after Hitler was gone. She saw the end of the Nazi regime as the end of everything. In her mind, the children couldn't live in a world without National Socialism. So even when others offered to smuggle the kids out, to give them a chance at survival, Magda refused. She had made up her mind. Her children would die with her. It was a terrible, terrible plan. First, she arranged for the children to be given morphine, one by an SS doctor. She needed to make them unconscious so they wouldn't feel what was coming next. Once they were sedated, cyanide capsules were crushed in their mouths to finish the job. On the 1st of May, 1945, just one day after Hitler took his own life, Magda perfectly executed her own plan. With the help of Dr. Ludwig Stumpf Egger, Hitler's personal physician, she began killing the children. One by one, they slipped into what was supposed to be a painless sleep. But for little Helga, things didn't exactly go according to plan. Helga, the eldest and Hitler's favorite, somehow didn't stay unconscious. The morphine either wasn't strong enough or wore off too quickly, and at some point during the process, she woke up and realized what was happening. Her siblings were dying, and she was next. Of course, Helga resisted. She didn't want to die. She struggled, kicked, and fought with everything she had. Magda and the SS doctor overpowered her, and eventually, cyanide was forced into her mouth. An autopsy conducted after the Soviets captured the bunker tells us just how violent her death had been. Helga had a lot of bruising on her face, and her jaw may have even been broken while they were force poisoning her. After the children were dead, Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked up to the garden outside the bunker. They sat on a bench side by side and took their own lives. Some say it was with cyanide. Others say Joseph also shot himself for good measure. Experts say that Magda once referred to Hitler as the greatest man of all time and believed her children should die rather than live in a world without him. Hitler and his soldiers.
In 1938, the Death's Head units numbered around 9,000 men.
Anyone who's into the little details of Nazi history knows that Hitler's troops were just as sick and twisted as he was. They were all sold a vision that was capable of exterminating everyone, including themselves. In the early years of World War II, when Germany was still riding high on victory after victory, many German soldiers took great pride in what they were doing. As horrifying as it was, many of them actively participated in or witnessed war crimes, mass shootings, executions, and other atrocities. And even worse, some of them documented it all with cameras. Soldiers would take photos or even film footage of themselves posing beside dead bodies, lining up civilians for execution, or setting villages on fire. And they weren't doing this in secret. In fact, many of them proudly mailed these pictures home to their families. To them, these images weren't shameful at all. They were proof of their hardness, their loyalty to the Nazi cause, and their ability to do what others couldn't.
The attack on the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. The war that Hitler always wanted. Teutons versus Bolshevists.
In their dark and twisted world, showing no mercy, especially to Jews, Roma people, and Slavic civilians, was not only acceptable, it was something to be admired. Hitler and the Nazi leadership had created a culture where being brute was celebrated. They believed that a real German man should be ruthless, unflinching, and emotionally cold. But as the tide of the war turned, especially after the defeat at Stalingrad in 1943, things began to shift. German soldiers and their families started realizing that the war might not end in their favor. And with that realization came fear.
Who's going to remember all this riffraff in 10 or 20 years' time? No one.
Suddenly, all those photos that once symbolized loyalty and strength turned into dangerous evidence against them. Soldiers began destroying them, tearing them up, burning them, hiding negatives, anything to erase the proof of what they'd done. They knew that when the war ended, the Allies would come looking for answers. What was even more terrifying was the possibility of being caught with those photos by the Soviet army. The Soviets had suffered too many losses, not just on the battlefield, but among civilians slaughtered by German death squads and occupation forces. If a German soldier was captured by Soviet troops and found with photographs of atrocities, that would mean immediate execution. Some families back in Germany who had kept these photos as souvenirs also rushed to destroy them as Allied forces moved in. They didn't want to be associated with war criminals, even if the war criminals were their own sons, brothers, or husbands. Adolf Hitler. In Lederhosen. Believe it or not, there was a time when Adolf Hitler didn't mind being photographed in shorts. In fact, before he rose to full power, his team staged several images of him wearing traditional Bavarian clothing, including Lederhosen, the famous leather shorts. The whole point of these early photos was to make Hitler look like a man of the people. He wanted to appear approachable, down to earth, and connected to German culture and tradition. He was trying to build a carefully crafted image in the eyes of the average German citizen. But all of that changed in 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. With his new position, he had a new image to uphold, one of power, discipline, and suddenly, those old photos didn't fit the narrative anymore. The shorts, which were once a symbol of cultural pride and simplicity, now made him feel exposed, literally and figuratively. Hitler reportedly believed that Lederhosen made him look like a peasant, and worse, they were beneath one's dignity for a head of state. So, what did he do? From that point on, he banned the publication of any images showing him in shorts. He considered them too casual and completely out of line with the cold, commanding image he now wanted to project.
Having joined his political party in 1920, standing by him through thick and thin.
One of the men responsible for helping build this image was Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer. Hoffmann had access to thousands and thousands of images of Hitler. After Hitler became chancellor, Hoffmann played a huge role in controlling which photos got released to the public and which ones were buried. In no time, the photos of Hitler in shorts quietly disappeared from circulation because Hoffmann knew that releasing those images now would damage the very mythology the Nazi regime was trying to build. But somehow, those forbidden images didn't fully disappear. They resurfaced years later in archives and history books, where people could see a very different side of the man who tried so hard to present himself as stoic and all-powerful. And seeing Hitler awkwardly posing in knee-length leather shorts today tells us that dictators, too, have moments they'd rather the world forget. Cielawa Kwoka. Wilhelm Brasse never planned on becoming the photographer of Auschwitz. Before the war, he was just a young man in his 20s, trained in photography and living a simple life in Poland. But everything changed when the Nazis invaded his home. Because he refused to swear allegiance to Hitler, and because of his Polish roots, he was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. What saved his life was his skill with a camera. The Nazis, who were obviously obsessed with order and documentation, wanted a photo of every prisoner. Brasse's job was now to take identification photos. Every prisoner needed a set: front-facing, side profile, and another angle. He ended up taking more than 40,000 of these grim portraits. Many of them were of terrified children, beaten women, or broken men. People who would often die days or even hours after their photos were taken. One of those faces belonged to this 14-year-old Polish girl named Cielawa Kwoka. Today, her photo is one of the most disturbing images to come out of the Holocaust. In the photo, she wears a headscarf, and her expression is just blank. What most people don't realize is that just moments before that picture was taken, Cielawa was beaten. Brasse later recalled how a female SS guard had struck her on the head with a stick, which likely caused injuries that she tried to hide beneath the scarf. She died not long after the photo was taken and never reached her 15th birthday. Now, as time went on, Auschwitz gradually went from being a labor camp to a full-blown death factory. The gas chambers became the central method of mass killing, and Brasse's role had to change too. Now, he wasn't just taking ID photos. He was being asked to document experiments, medical procedures, and even the aftermath of mass killings. He worked directly under Joseph Mengele, the famous Angel of Death, who carried out horrific experiments on twins, children, and pregnant women. Brasse had no choice. Refusal meant death.
Także to była tego rodzaju praca. Czasem parę słów powiedziałem, że tutaj, prawda, nic się wam nie stanie, uspokajałem, wie pani.
In exchange for his work, Brasse was given certain privileges most prisoners could only dream of: better food, warmer clothes, and even the ability to shower. But those comforts came with a terrible price. He was witnessing the worst of human cruelty, day in and day out, and was being forced to photograph it. As the war neared its end, and the Nazis realized they were losing, they tried to cover their tracks. Brasse was ordered to destroy all the photographs and erase the visual evidence of their crimes. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. So, quietly and at great personal risk, he saved thousands of these images. They later served as solid evidence in war crimes trials and as lasting proof of what happened behind those barbed wire fences. Brasse survived the war and lived until 2012. But the trauma never left him, and he never took another photograph again. Hitler in Holy Mass. This photo shows something you don't often associate with Adolf Hitler: him attending Holy Mass. It's one of the rare moments caught on camera where Hitler is inside a church. And interestingly, it would turn out to be one of the last times he ever attended a religious service that wasn't a funeral. Now, if you look closely at the image, you'll notice something a little odd: a tall box featuring half of a Polish eagle. It was part of a memorial Hitler had set up to honor Józef Piłsudski, the former leader of Poland who had died just a few months earlier in 1935. Why would Hitler, who would go on to invade Poland just 4 years later, honor a Polish leader? That's where things get interesting. Despite being enemies later, Hitler supposedly admired Piłsudski, especially for his role in the 1920 Polish-Soviet War. Piłsudski had led the Polish army to a victory against the Red Army, halting the spread of communism into Europe. For Hitler, who hated communism with a passion, this was actually worthy of respect. He likely saw Piłsudski not just as a strong nationalist, but as a man who had proven himself militarily against the Bolsheviks. At this point in time, in the mid-1930s, Nazi Germany and Poland actually had a non-aggression pact. Relations between the two countries were not as openly hostile as they would become by 1939. This memorial and Mass were part of a brief, strange moment in history where Hitler was still playing the diplomatic game, trying to look respectful, calculated, and even reverent whenever it suited his goals. But don't let the image fool you. Hitler's relationship with religion was complicated at best. He sometimes used religious imagery or language to gain support, but the truth is, he had very little interest in faith. After this, he'd rarely be seen in a religious setting again, unless it was at someone's funeral. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you're curious about more controversial moments from history, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. See you soon.